This is a Sicho from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Parshas Vayechi, Sicho Beis, and the topic of the Sicho is that in this week's Parsha, we learn how Yosef placed Menashe to the right and Ephraim to the left of Yaakov, and how Yaakov then switched his hands. And there are four parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number one, explain that there are two perspectives about who is greater. Number two, explain each of these perspectives. Number three, explain why Yosef's perspective is that Menashe is greater, and Yaakov's perspective is that Ephraim is greater. And number four, present the Hira in Avodas Hashem. In this week's Sedra, it relates how Yosef placed his two sons, Ephraim and Menashe, before Yaakov in order for Yaakov to bench them. And he placed Menashe to the right of Yaakov, and Ephraim to the left of Yaakov. Yaakov then switched his hands, and he placed his right hand on Ephraim, and his left hand on Menashe. When Yosef saw this, so Vayechi be'enav, he wasn't happy with this. Vayemer Yosef al Aviv, and he said to his father, Lo yichin avi ki ze Menashe bechor. This is not correct, but rather Menashe is the bechor. Sim yemincha al reisha, so place your right hand on Menashe. And Yaakov responded to this, Yadaiti b'ni yadaiti, I know this. Gamhu, he indeed will also be great. V'ulam achiv hakatin yigdal mimenu. However, his younger brother Ephraim would be greater than him. And Vayasam es Ephraim lifnei Menashe, he placed Ephraim before Menashe, both by putting his right hand on Ephraim, and also in the bracha he mentioned Ephraim before Menashe. We're going to begin by establishing 2 points, which are going to be the basis for the entire Sicha. And the first point is going to be presented in the form of a question and answer. So the first point is, we need to understand, the reason a Bechor is deserving of receiving a greater bracha than all the other children is not just because the Bechor was born first, but rather the Bechor is born first because the Bechor possesses an advantage and greater prominence than the other children. And that's why the Bechor is born first, and that's why the Bechor is deserving of receiving a greater bracha. And so the question is, since Ephraim's level surpassed Menashe's, as Yaakov said, that Achav HaKatan Yigdal Mimenu, so why was it ordained from above that Menashe would be the Bechor and not Ephraim? And so this leads to the conclusion that although Achav HaKatan Yigdal Mimenu, that Ephraim has an advantage over Menashe, but nevertheless, Menashe obviously possessed an advantage over Ephraim, and therefore he was Yosef's Bechor. And it's just that with regards to Yaakov's bracha, the quality in which Ephraim was greater than Menashe was more important. And therefore, by the bracha of Yaakov, Vayasam es Ephraim lifnei Menashe. So the first point basically is that even though Ephraim had a greatness, an advantage over Menashe, but obviously Menashe also possessed a quality in which he surpassed Ephraim, and that's the reason why he was Yosef's Bechor. And it's just that in regards to the bracha of Yaakov, the greatness of Ephraim was more relevant and was Negeah, and not the greatness and advantage of Menashe. Now moving on to the second point. So another Indian in this is, as we spoke many times, there are no mistakes chas v'shalom by tzaddikim, and especially by the Avos and Shvatim. And this is especially true in regards to their matters which are stated in Teres Emes. These matters are certainly true and eternal. In addition, since Torah is Meloshen Hira, so there are also an eternal Hira for every Yid in all generations. And so from here it's understood that Yosef's claim, Yosef's perspective, Kizah HaBechor, Sim Yemincha al Reishei, that Menashe is the Bechor, and Yaakov should place his right hand on Menashe, it wasn't because he chas v'sholom made a mistake and didn't know that Achiv HaKatan and Ephraim Yigdal Mimenu. Rather, it's because Yosef held that the greatness of Menashe, which is the reason he was the Bechor of Yosef, outweighed the greatness of Ephraim. What this means is that both approaches, meaning both Yosef's, that the greatness of Menashe is more important, and Yaakov's approach, that the greatness of Ephraim is more important, both of these approaches are true. From the perspective of Yosef, Menashe is greater, and from the perspective of Yaakov, Ephraim is greater. And this is the reason that in regards to Uli Yosef Yulat Shnei Bonim, when it comes to who Yosef had as a child, that Menashe was the Bechor, because the Koyach HaAv is found more in the Bechor. Whereas in their connection to Yaakov, it says, Shnei Bonecha, your two sons, Yosef, Li Hein, they are mine, Ephraim and Menashe, Kiruven v'Shimon Yuli. That Ephraim is said before Menashe, and Ephraim is like Reuven, who is Yaakov's Bechor. So what we're saying over here is that in addition to each of them having an advantage, from Yosef's perspective, it's correct and true to say that the advantage and greatness of Menashe is more prominent and important, and it deserves the greater bracha. And from Yaakov's perspective, it's Ephraim who is greater and more important, and he deserves to be first and have the greater bracha. Considering these 2 points, so this is not actually said in the Sicha, but it comes out that there's a question, which is, what is the explanation of these 2 points? What's the explanation that we're saying that both Ephraim and Menashe each possess a different advantage in greatness? And what's the explanation for the point that Yosef appreciates more the advantage and greatness of Menashe, and Yaakov appreciates more the advantage and greatness of Ephraim? So the difference between Menashe and Ephraim, and also how the greatness of Menashe is connected to Yosef, and the greatness of Ephraim is connected to Yaakov, will be understood based on the difference in their names. Both names, Menashe, which he was called Menashe because Kineshani Elikim es Kol Amoli, Ve'es Kol Beis Avi, that Hashem made him jump away to forget his father's home, and Ephraim, who was given his name, Ki Efrani Elikim Be'eretz Ani, Hashem made him great and to multiply in this land of Mitzrayim, this land of affliction. So both of these express the feelings which the descent, the Yerida in Mitzrayim, evoked by Yosef. But each communicates an opposite aspect. Menashe, the name Menashe reminded Yosef that Noshani Beis Avi, that he's living in a place which makes him spring away, makes him forget Beis Avi. This expresses his yearning not to forget, but rather to be connected to Beis Avi. The way a person remembers something is by feeling that they're forgetting about it and they don't want to forget about it. That reminds a person of this thing that's important to them. On the other hand, Ephraim, so in contrast, the name Ephraim is an expression of thanks and praise for Hifrani Elikim Be'eretz Ani, for the greatness and advantage which he reached in Mitzrayim. So both of these names, they express the feelings that going into Mitzrayim evoked by Yosef. One feeling is that he's forgetting his father's home and he doesn't want to forget it. And one is an expression of thanks for the greatness that he achieved by being in Mitzrayim. Now, these two inyanim of Menashe and Ephraim are connected to the two approaches in the Avodah of a Yid in Eretz Ani, meaning the Avodah of a Yid in Galus. One approach is that a Yid toils not to be influenced by the surrounding environment. So that's the person's Avodah. They're in Galus and they're laboring, they're toiling not to be influenced by the Galus, and they do this through being attached to Beis Avi, meaning they do this through being attached to the state of how it was before the Yerida in Galus. One constantly reminds themselves that they are in a situation which makes them forget Beis Avi, makes them forget where they were before this Yerida, and all this helps a person not to forget. So the first approach is all about not being influenced and not being affected by the darkness of the Galus. The person does this by reminding themselves where they were before the Yerida and Galus. And then there's a second approach, which is that a person and their Avodah is in Eretz Ani, in the darkness of Galus. It's not about not being affected by the darkness of Galus, it's about doing an Avodah in that darkness. And they do this to the extent that the person doesn't remember so much the Beis Avi, unlike in the first way, that the person is constantly trying to remember how they were before the Yerida in order not to be influenced. Here the person is focusing on doing an Avodah in the Galus, and so they're not remembering so much the Beis Avi how it was beforehand. The person toils in Eretz Ani until Hifran Elikim Dafka Beretz Ani. They actually grow through that Avodah. And this Avodah in Eretz Ani is to illuminate the darkness of Galus with the Eir of Kedusha. And this actually achieves a greatness and advantage in the person doing the Avodah, that they can have Ifrani Elikim Beretz Ani. So one approach is about not being influenced by the darkness of Galus. And the other approach is about doing an Avodah in the darkness of Galus, to bring light into the Galus and to actually transform the darkness of Galus into light. According to this, we can now understand why Ephraim is Yigdal Mimenu than Menashe. Because the ultimate purpose of the Yerida in Mitzrayim and in Galus in general is the Yerida Tzeirech Aliyah. that a person should reach an aliyah higher than before the Yerida. Not just not to forget Beis Avi, which is the Avodah of Menashe, which means not to be influenced, that the Yerida shouldn't cause a Yerida, but the person should stay on the previous level. That's not the purpose of Galus, but rather primarily to achieve something in Galus, to have an aliyah. The goal is that there should be a gain through the Yerida, the Ifrani Elikim Beretz Anyi. So since that's the ultimate purpose, that's why Ephraim is Yigdal Mimenu than Menashe. On the other hand, Menashe is the Becher. He was born first, because in the Leda, in the revelation, meaning the Avodah B'Poyel, there Menashe comes before Ephraim. Before a person can have a positive impact in Eretz Anyi to achieve Ephraim Elikim, that a person could transform the darkness to light, which is the inyan of Asay Toiv, that the person is accomplishing and doing something in the darkness. Before that, one must first ensure that they aren't affected by the darkness of Galus, which is the inyan of Sur Meirah. And how is this done? This is done through constantly remembering and connecting with Beis Avi. So that's why in Leda, meaning in the Avodah B'Poyel, Menashe comes first. A person cannot succeed at Tifrani Elikim Beretz Anyi to transform the darkness into light if they don't first ensure that they're safe from the darkness. So the person has to protect themselves from the darkness. That's done through remembering Beis Avi. And then afterwards, they're able to do the Asay Tov, which means transform the darkness into light, to accomplish something in the Galus. So however, since the ultimate purpose is the Aliyah, which is Ephraim, so therefore for Yaakov's bracha, what's the connection to Yaakov's bracha? Which is the bracha in the Sinas Koyach from above for the Aveda of Galus. So there Ephraim is more prominent, because the whole idea of this bracha is in the Sinas Koyach for the Galus, for the Aveda of Galus. And the whole purpose of the Aveda in Galus is the Aliyah. So therefore, Ephraim is more prominent. Vayasam es Ephraim l'fnei Menashe. So in the Leda, which is associated with Yosef, there Menashe comes first. However, in the ultimate purpose and goal, which the brachas and Sinas Koyach for that, there Ephraim is first and Ephraim is greater. A deeper explanation of all this, of the Avodah and Galus, there are a number of inyanim in the greatness and advantage which a Yid achieves through the Avodah in the darkness of Galus. There are three things. Number one is the Yerida in Galus reveals the taikif of the neshama not to be affected by the darkness of Galus. That's one thing that the Yerida of Galus accomplishes. This is similar to the idea of how a managid, when there's opposition, it triggers and awakens the midas hanetzachin, and also similar to the explanation on the pasuk of Tzama L'cha Nafshi, that when is it Tzama L'cha Nafshi? Specifically, Be'eretz Tzia V'ayif, when there's darkness and concealment. And Halavai B'kodesh Chaziz Sicha, meaning when there's revelation, when there's Gilui, this taikif of the neshama is not there. So that's one thing that the Yerida of Galus, the Yerida in Galus accomplishes, that it reveals the taikif of the neshama that is otherwise concealed and hidden. Then there's a deeper level, number two, which is that a great Yerida brings out the deeper taikif of the neshama, more than the first one. And this is a taikif which has no limits. The taikif of the neshama that we're talking about over here, which has no limits, has the koyach not just that Galus shouldn't affect it, but to the contrary, adarabba, to affect its surroundings and elevate them to its level, to the extent that it can be mahapich, it could transform the darkness of Galus into light. So the first one is that the Yerida brings out a taikif of the neshama not to be affected. This is something the neshama had beforehand. It's just that it needs this galus to bring it out. And then a deeper level is that it brings out the taikif of the neshama, which is bligvul. But this also, it was there beforehand in the neshama. It's just that the Yerida brings it out. So these two inyanim are already in the neshama, and it's just that they become revealed through the avodah and galus. However, there's an even higher inyan, which is that through transforming the darkness of galus into light, so the neshama achieves a level that it doesn't have previously. The being mahapich of choshech into er gives the neshama something which the neshama didn't have beforehand. Unlike the first two, which is there in the neshama, it just needs the Yerida to reveal them. And this is similar to a Baal Tshuva who has zachis which come from zdainis, which a tzaddik doesn't have. It's a certain type of thing that does not exist for the neshama on its own. A tzaddik can't have it. It's through the Yerida and the choshech that this entirely new thing is accomplished. On this basis of the deeper explanation and these three levels, we can appreciate the difference between Menashe and Ephraim. Both Menashe and Ephraim are Yosef's children, meaning they both reveal his inyan of Yosef Hashem li bein acher, to make from the acher bein, meaning the hisafa, the increase, which is achieved through the avodah and galus, transforming the acher, the sitra acher, into a bein. However, in this hisafa that is achieved through the avodah and galus, there are two levels. Number one is Menashe, which Menashe, like we said, refers to the powerful memory of Beis Avi. This refers to the Taikif of the Neshama, which was revealed by Yosef through his Avodah in Mitzrayim, which corresponds to the first two levels, where we spoke about the Taikif of the Neshama, that's otherwise Behelim Vehester, that becomes revealed through the Chayshech and Helim Vehester of the Galus. Either it's the Taikif of the Neshama not to be influenced, or it's the infinite Taikif of the Neshama, that it can even be Mahapech the Chayshech to the Ur. And then there's Ephraim. Ephraim refers to the Yisr and Ur, which is drawn down from the darkness itself. Not the taikif of the neshama, the yisr ra'ur that comes from the darkness itself, the Ifrani Elikim Beretz Onyi. And since this is the ultimate purpose of the Galus, therefore Ephraim is greater than Menashe. However, according to this, it becomes even more difficult to understand the connection between Menashe to Yosef and Ephraim to Yaakov. Seemingly, it should be the opposite. Menashe, who comes to remind one of Beis Avi, should be more connected to Yaakov. That Yosef is talking about Beis Avi, he's talking about Yaakov. And Ephraim, who is Ephraim Elikim Beretz Oni, which comes from the Avodah of Yosef Hashem Li Bein Acher, that should be connected to Yosef. That's the whole idea of Yosef. Yosef Hashem Li Bein Acher. So we'll understand this by first explaining the pasuk Va'ato shnei bonecha hanoilodim l'cha be'eretz Mitzrayim ad bo yelecha Mitzrayima. So li heim Ephraim and Menashe Keruvin v'Shimon yiyu li. When the question is that it would be enough to say in short Va'ato shnei bonecha Ephraim and Menashe li heim Keruvin v'Shimon yiyu li. What's the need for the words where it describes shnei bonecha? Which ones? Hanoilodim l'cha be'eretz Mitzrayim ad bo yelecha Mitzrayima. The ones that were born to you in the land of Mitzrayim before my coming to Mitzrayim. So the answer is that these words, Hanelodim l'cha be'eretz Mitzrayim, ad bo yelecha Mitzrayim, are not just a simon for which of Yosef's children will be counted in the number of the Shvatim. It's the ones that were born to you in Eretz Mitzrayim before I descended to Mitzrayim. It's not just a simon. Rather, it's also a reason and an explanation for why they are counted to Yaakov. Why is it liheim? It's because they were born to Yosef in Eretz Mitzrayim. And in addition, Ad bo yelecha Mitzrayim, but before Yaakov came to Mitzrayim, therefore liheim. So very simply, the explanation is because despite them being born in Mitzrayim and raised in an environment without Yaakov, so they were both in Mitzrayim and before Yaakov came to Mitzrayim, and nevertheless they behaved and conducted themselves like Yaakov's grandchildren, therefore liheim. This, that they were raised and lived like Yaakov's grandchildren, despite being born in Mitzrayim, and despite it not being under the influence of Yaakov, this reflects the true perfection of Yaakov. And as we'll explain later in the Sicha, how this is connected to the true perfection of Yaakov. But on a very simple level, this is the idea of mitasei shlema, that all of Yaakov's children and grandchildren were raised and lived in the way of Yaakov. The true perfection of that is by those who were born in Mitzrayim and not under the influence of Yaakov, and still they lived like Yaakov's grandchildren. According to this, we can understand why Yaakov placed Ephraim before Menashe in this context. Menashe, so since Menashe expresses how the memory and connection of Beis Avi does not cease, so therefore it comes out that this manner of Avodah, that the person is constantly attached to Beis Avi, it doesn't contain the real state of Ad bo yelecha Mitzrayim, that I'm not in Mitzrayim, because this is an Avodah of remembering Yaakov, bringing Yaakov into Mitzrayim, since the memory of Beis Avi is constantly there. The true state of Ad bo yelecha Mitzrayim, that not just it's in Mitzrayim, but it's without Yaakov, is in the Avodah of Ephraim. This Avodah of Ephraim expresses how one is found in Eretz Onyi. There's no revealed connection with Yaakov to the Beis Avi, and nevertheless, one does their Avodah in a manner that it's apparent that they are Yaakov's grandchild. That's the whole idea of Ephraim, that there isn't this constant reminder of Beis Avi, but rather there's an Avodah in Eretz Onyi. And even there, it's apparent that this is Yaakov's grandchild. That is a much greater ad ba'elecha Mitzrayim than the avodah of Menashe, and that's why over here Yaakov placed Ephraim before Menashe. To explain this further, it's explained in Chassidus that Yaakov is midas emes, which the mid of emes is mavriach min hakotza el hakotza. It goes through every level. It's not confined and limited only to certain places. It goes from the very highest kotza to the very lowest kotza. And this idea of midas emes of Yaakov is accomplished through Yosef, because the level of Yaakov himself, not his midas emes, his actual level, is in Atzilus, which is above the worlds of Biyah. And Yosef brings down the level of Yaakov Atzilus into the worlds of Biyah, all the way to Elam Hazat Tachten, which is the very lowest Kotze. And this is the inner reason why the Yerida of Yaakov Mitzrayim, which refers to the Mitzrayim and Gvulim of Biyah, was through Yosef, because that's the point of Yosef, to accomplish and execute this midas emes of Yaakov, that it's from the Kotza Achi Elyon to the Kotza Achi Tachten. And this is also true regarding the very highest Kotza, that specifically through his Hapcha Chashuchal and Ahira, the Indian of Yosef Hashem Li Bein Acher, which is what Yosef does, there is then the Yisr Na'er and Acheshach higher than Atzilus, which is the level of Yaakov on his own. So you have both the Kotza Achi Tachten, that it goes all the way into Biyah, into Elam Hazat Tachten, and you also have the Kotza Elyon, that through this Avodah it achieves something even greater than the Madrego of Yaakov himself in Atzilus. And this also explains why the 17 years which Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim were his best years. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim shva esrei shana. This is because he reached his ultimate perfection, his shleimus of Mavriach min hakotza el hakotza, through the Yerida in Mitzrayim, which reflects and expresses the midas emes of Yaakov. Bringing Menashe and Ephraim into this new idea. So since Ephraim and Menashe take the place of Yosef in the number of the Shvatim, so it's understood that they are similar to Toldos Yaakov, to Yosef, in bringing down the Inyanim of Yaakov in Eretz Mitzrayim. And actually in doing so, they have an advantage over Yosef, because the level of Yaakov Atzilus shines in a revealed way in Yosef, even in the way he descends to Mitzrayim Elam Biyah. And since the Ashpa from Yaakov, which is higher than Mitzrayim Biyah, shines in his Avodah, that of Yosef, so Melachatchila there's no possibility for the Helam and Hester of Mitzrayim. And on the contrary, Adarabba, we know that Yosef ruled over Mitzrayim. According to this, it comes out that the Avodah of Yosef is not the real Yerida in the darkness of Mitzrayim. It's not the very lowest Kotza. And this is similar to what actually occurred, that as long as Yosef lived, there couldn't be any decrees, any xeris against the Yidden. It was as if they didn't really descend to Mitzrayim. Only after the passing of Yosef does it say in the Medrash that Ki'ilu Oisa Ayim Nichnasu Mitzrayim. So Yosef is really not really going to the lowest Kotza, because there shines in Yosef the level of Yaakov. Specifically through Shnei Banecha HaNeiladim Lecha Be'eretz Mitzrayim Ad Ba'elecha Mitzrayim. It's before Yaakov even entered the picture, which is the Avodah in a place where the level of Yaakov isn't seen. In the darkness of Mitzrayim, which is Mailim and Master, and a Menaget to Kedusha, is the ultimate perfection of Yaakov, which is Mavriach min hakotza el hakotza achieved. So it's specifically through the sons of Yosef. Now these three levels, Yaakov, which on his own he is higher than Mitzrayim, it's Atzilus. Yosef, which shines Mitzrayim with the Ashpa of Yaakov, so he's in Mitzrayim, but it shines there the level of Yaakov. And then the sons of Yosef, which relates to the darkness of Mitzrayim the way it is. So they three generally correspond to the three inyanim we described in the earlier part of the Sicha, the three different levels in the Yisrael that's achieved through the Yerida and Galus. The first inyan was that because of the Taikif of the Neshama, the Galus can't affect the Yerida and the Neshama. That brings out the Taikif that the Neshama shouldn't be affected by its surroundings. So it comes out that it's as if one is removed and above Galus. This is similar to Yaakov, who is above going down to Mitzrayim. The second inyan, that relative to the Taikif of the Neshama, there can't be any opposition. And so the darkness is transformed to light. It's the infinite taikah of the neshama, that it can be mahapech the chayshich ta'er, is similar to the avodah of Yosef, which brings down the level of Yaakov in Mitzrayim, which causes this hapcha chashechel and ahira. And the third inyan of the Yisrin of the light, which is drawn from the darkness itself, is achieved through the Aveda in the darkness of Mitzrayim, where the Ashpa of Yaakov isn't seen, which is the Banecha Neiladim L'cha Beretz Mitzrayim Ad Bayelecha. So we have one inyan of Yaakov, that the person is entirely above Golus, not being affected and influenced by Golus. You have another inyan where the Ashpa of Yaakov goes into the Golus, and therefore it could affect even his Hapcha Chashuchel and Ahira. But it's all an extension of the Eir of the Neshama. And then you have another inyan, which is explained more in the Urs, where the Chayshech of Golus is there, and there's a Yisrim which is accomplished through being Mahapech the Chayshech to Eir. That the Chayshech itself turns into Eir. And that is accomplished through Menashe and Ephraim, through the sons of Yosef, that they are in Mitzrayim like Yosef, but at the same time, it's not about the Eir of Yaakov going into Mitzrayim, and therefore it's really above Mitzrayim, but just also being Mahapechet because of its infinite Taikif, but rather there's the darkness itself, and the darkness is transformed into light. According to all this, we can now understand the connection of Menashe to Yosef, which therefore he was Yosef's Becher, and Ephraim to Yaakov. So by Menashe, since the union of Menashe is to reveal the memory of Beis Avi, and thereby is able to transform the darkness of Mitzrayim, so this is similar to what we just said, the Avodah of Yosef, who draws down the union of Yaakov, which is Beis Avi to Biyah, and thereby transforms the darkness to light. And Ephraim, so the ultimate perfection of Yaakov, which we said Yaakov is Midas Emes, is specifically through the Yisrin Ha'erm and HaCheshech Atzmei, the Cheshech itself. And this is accomplished through Ephraim, which is the inyan of Ephraim Elikim Be'eretz Onyi. And so Menashe is connected more to Yosef, and Ephraim more to Yaakov. In conclusion, Yidden are called with the name of Yosef, as it says, Noye Katzain Yosef. And so from this it's understood that every Yid is to have both Avodas of Menashe and Ephraim. First and foremost, a Yid must wish and yearn to be in Beis Avi, which means to be in a state which is above Golus. A Yid's Yerida into the Helam of the world. To be mevar the Golus has to be Onus al Pi Adibur. It has to be forced, because the Yid doesn't want to be there. And as a result, immediately upon completing one shluchus in the place of Golus, where Hashem sent the person, one immediately runs to a place where they can entirely dedicate themselves to Inyan Kedusha Torah Avodah. On the other hand, one must however know that as long as they are in their shluchus and galus, when they're there, one may not suffice just with the Avodah of Menashe, which means to only be concerned with oneself, that they shouldn't forget Beis Avi and not be affected by the surrounding environment. This Avodah of being in the galus is a preparation for the ultimate purpose, to accomplish Yifran Elikim Be'eretz Oni, to shine the darkness of galus with Ner Mitzvah V'Teir to the extent of being Mahapech, transforming the darkness of galus into light, V'Layla Kayem Yoyer. So it's not enough that a person just protects and safeguards themselves, but there is a mission, an asay toiv, that the person has to work with the darkness and be Mahapech the Cheshech Toir.